Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Let me say something about Richard's book, Fighting Pollution. This book really helped me get involved in climate change after I retired from the quality field. It's really a wonderful book. Just going to tell you one story from it. As a young assistant attorney general in Maryland at the Department of Natural Resources, Richard's office got a call that there was a giant ship in the Chesapeake Bay and it was polluting. They called the owners in New York. They tried to contact the ship. Nothing helped. So the lawyers got together and they had basically the park police had a little boat, and they had the park policemen to take their little boat out to this giant freighter, climb aboard the freighter, go to the conning tower, find the captain, put him in handcuffs, and take him to the Annapolis City Jail. And soon after that, the lawyer showed up and the pollution stopped. And that is in Richard's book, along with many other wonderful stories about what it was like to be fighting pollution. He learned how to use the law to fight pollution and climate change. And Richard went on to a really stellar career at the EPA. So Richard, it's now turning it over to you.
Well, I never had so much fun as when I was a state prosecutor of polluters in Maryland. Then I became a Fed in Washington, and I was briefly our nation's top lawyer for all EPA investigations of pollution crime. And the last 17 years of my career, I worked for EPA internationally, helping other nations wanting clean air and clean water. And I started seeing climate change coming on about 30 years ago. So I'm going to get right into it. I only have about 10 minutes. I want to give you 4 clear takeaways. And my first takeaway is shown on this next slide, where humanity, as we see here, began only about 250,000 years ago. And since 500 million years ago, when life on Earth in its simplest forms began, there have been 5 mass extinction events caused by natural climate change. Now, from the New York Yankees, I suppose many of us know the baseball player and folksy philosopher Yogi Berra. And I love Yogi. He said, when I start with this quote, "The future ain't what it used to be." And you may or may not know that now already we are in the middle of the 6th mass extinction of life on Earth. And quickly, you just run through these pictures quickly to see the animals. These are called charismatic megafauna, driven to the edge of extinction just to harvest and sell their parts. But many other less able and large species are being killed off at about up to 1,000 times the natural rate by the world's most invasive species, which of course is humanity. Man-made global warming is now extinguishing the polar bear living at the edge because they cannot catch seals when there's no ice. And how ironic that a major cause of heat in the North Pole is synthetic, meaning man-made, chemicals, the refrigerants in our air conditioning equipment. To stay cool in our homes, we are killing off the polar bears in their homes. Home, the North Pole. Well, a book about this that I highly recommend for you is to read Elizabeth Colbert's book, The Sixth Extinction, An Unnatural History. It's a great title. And from the title, you can surmise, David, is there something in covering the top of this picture of the book, or is it free and clear?
No, it's okay. Just keep going. You're doing fine.
I've got something that says resize to change the video or something.
No, don't worry about it.
All right. Well, you can surmise from the title that this extinction happening now is the first unnatural extinction, and if completed, it will be the first and last man-made extinction. You must read her book. See my short reading list, which I hope the hosts will post for you or send to you. And like me, she's not a scientist, but she showed me from my book how to include many adventures to entertain despite the frightening science, which is also in our books. Now, this picture shows the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse: plague, famine, war, and death. And my first takeaway point for you is this. Humanity is on a path to participate in the 6th extinction now happening, For the geologic record of and the biochemical dynamics, you can ask about this in the Q&A. I won't have time to describe it, but the biochemical dynamics of mass extinctions are described in a book by Peter D. Ward entitled I'll have to read, you can't really read the subtext. It says, Under a Green Sky, Global Warming, the Mass Extinctions of the Past, are what they tell us about our future. Past extinctions were caused by magma from the Earth's core, burning up through the cold and oil already underground, erupting as lava and volcanoes and emitting too much CO2. And it then created hydrogen sulfide, a deadly gas that repeatedly has wiped out much life on Earth. And today, with our business as usual burning fossil fuels, there's no reason to think that the Earth's future will not be like the past. Why would geologic history not repeat itself? And as for timing, I'll just say it could happen that our great-great-grandchildren will complete the man-made sixth extinction as a mass suicide as early as sometime in the next century. The second takeaway is this, and you may not be able to read this sign on the bridge, but it says, time to buy a new home. Well, during the lives of our grandchildren, the everyday street flooding will be so bad as to begin to shut down our seaports and cause our descendants to begin to abandon vast coastal areas in all our major cities at sea level. Superstorm Sandy ruined these New York cabs, and it's just a hint of what's coming. Catastrophic ocean flooding is now inevitable, you might say baked in, and the reason is that the last time CO2 was at today's level of more than 420 parts per million was 3.5 to 5 million years ago, when the sea was 65 to 85 feet higher, and geologic history indicates it's probably too late to prevent the loss of, in the 22nd century, of much of coastal America. And of course, this risk has doubled during the last 40 years or more, while coal and oil companies covered up the scientific facts well known to them. If we melt all the ice on Earth, the sea will rise 220 feet, and this last picture shows where the sea will be with Florida completely gone. And interestingly, the sea will also go hundreds of miles up the Mississippi River. Now, again, in the words of that famous philosopher, Yogi Berra, and I quote, you can observe a lot by just watching. Now, high tide on Main Street, Rising Sea Level and the Coming Coastal Crisis is another book on my list for you by my friend the oceanographer John Englander, and he has just been watching, and he assembled this helpful chart that covers 425,000 years to show that CO2, heat, and sea level all rise and fall together. Now, on the extreme right upper hand, right side up top side corner, you can see that the CO2 is rising literally off the chart. And CO2 naturally stays in the air and the sea. 92% of it goes into the sea for at least 1,000 years. So this chart shows that catastrophic sea level rise is now inevitable. Temperature rise lags a decade or two, and sea level rise lags a century or two behind CO2 rise. But in geologic terms, it's simultaneous concurrence or synchronicity, and very soon our big cities will be drowning. Our third takeaway is that the already terrifying geologic record that I've just shown you, based only on CO2 emissions, cannot tell us exactly where and when we will get to where we are going. Now, Yogi Berra also said, if you don't know where you'll end up someplace else. The geologic record does not include the refrigerants that we recently invented to kill the polar bears. The geologic record does not include industrial agriculture emitting nitrous oxide, fracking, and thousands of miles of leaky gas pipes to and inside of old cities are not in the geologic record. These are all man-made, recently powerful climate killers. So we are stumbling in the dark, coming very, very soon to a so-called climate cliff or tipping point of no return. Your fourth takeaway is that nature has turned against us. You might say that Mother Nature is angry with us, her bad children. Well, what in the world do I mean by that? Well, scientists would put it this way. Our negligence has activated feedback loops in nature that cause many natural forces to amplify and accelerate the coming climate chaos. Now, most obvious is the feedback loop between forest fires caused by drought, which cause more forest fires, which cause more drought. We all understand that. But here are three more feedback loops that, and there are many more than this, but here are three of the more obvious ones. Now, as seen in this picture in Siberia, global warming of the tundra causes methane, which is natural gas, to leak and even erupt, making deep craters. It looks like a rocket ship came out of that, but that's a methane eruption hole. We have melted the Arctic Sea reflective ice cover, so now in the feedback loop, the warm sea naturally warms a nearby land, melts the permafrost, and releases natural methane that is a far more powerful climate killer per molecule than CO2. The next feedback loop is, and we want to see Antarctica, David, where several big glaciers are being undermined by deep water warmed by climate change. There we go. I'm not going to talk about the Totten Glacier. That's probably the biggest glacier in the world in East Antarctica, but the ones in West Antarctica, there are about 6 of them. Those are being undermined. They're footed in about 1,500 feet of water, but standing on land 2 miles high. And now nature's warm water in the sea threatens to cause these glaciers to lose their foothold, to slip off the land, to melt in the sea and drown all the world's seaports. Maybe 10 feet of sea level rise if they all go in. I'm talking about the Thwaites Glacier, the Pine Island Glacier, there are others. The third feedback loop, a different danger, is black soot. And here we do see that filth from our ordinary air pollution makes Greenland's ice less reflective. Scientists say that now it has a low albedo effect, as ice absorbs the sunlight instead of reflecting it and speeds the melting. Well, if all the ice of Greenland is gone, we get 20 feet of sea level rise. From the several poems in my book, I have selected and read this one poem adopted in the mid-19th century by abolitionists opposing slavery. It's also a Protestant hymn, and I think it's well worth hearing it read out loud and slowly. And it's the name of the title of the poem is the first line. Once to every man and nation comes the moment to decide in the strife of truth and falsehood, for the good or evil side, some great cause, some great decision, offering each the bloom or blight, and the choice goes by forever twixt that darkness and that light. David, the microphone is yours.
So CP is a measure of how much heat is coming down onto Earth. When we get to the Paris Agreement is based on an RCP of 1.9, which suggests at this point. So these are terms you'll need to know. And medium, intermediate, that's called the intermediate forecast. You'll see things like this, 4 feet of sea level rise. What this would basically mean, if we took the RCP of 4, the Chesapeake Bay, where I live in Baltimore, by 2050 will rise. So these are the scientific projections of sea level rise based on the amount of heat that's hitting the Earth's surface. And I might mention that when I was taking these, it's in Louisiana, and it is the roadway oil refineries. So Louisiana at great cost. Someone could explain to me why Louisiana is such a poor state with so many oil refineries. I'd be very curious to understand.
Well, there you go.
So these are some examples of adaptation. Now, another area where adaptation for some of the risks. So this is an example from the Quality Progress article. Well, it's obvious Miami is at high risk for sea level rise, but Las Vegas, if you have a warehouse in Las Vegas, why would they be at risk for sea level rise? Well, think about it. Why would they be at risk in Las Vegas? Well, Las Vegas is dependent upon what? The port of San Diego. So if the port of San Diego is at risk, then your Las Vegas facility is at risk. So these are some tools to help you think that through. This is in the Resiliency Toolkit as a matrix to help you think it through, and these are tools that we in the quality professions are well ready to use and to help our companies. Here's just a little trip that I took. In October, you see flooded streets, sea level rise, sea level rise. Well, there's an adaptation plan. This is the adaptation plan for Cambridge, Maryland. What are we going to do? Well, the adaptation plan is at great cost to build a seawall. So this is adaptation after the fact. Now you may say, I have a factory. What is adaptation for the factory? This is actually from Boston. You have to determine how much of your building is susceptible to flooding, and then you can take action. One action is called wet floodproofing. You actually allow water, these vents allow water to go into the basement of your building. So that is one solution. And then another type of solution is to stop the water from going into your building by putting up these walls. And you go around Baltimore, downtown Baltimore, you'll see these walls like this in buildings. And when it rains, the maintenance crew comes out and they put these walls up to deal with street flooding. So this is adaptation. Here's another adaptation at the beach. Delaware, I just came back from Delaware. This is very common. They'll raise the appliances about 10 feet off the ground, and this is adaptation. Doesn't prevent, it's adapting to sea level rise. So team 3 is mitigation. How do we lower greenhouse gases? So the first thing I had to get my head around is this. I'm sitting in class, and they're talking about burning coal. And they give this example. You burn, coal is about 80% carbon. So you burn 2,000 pounds of coal. So picture a pickup truck filled with 2,000 pounds of coal. You burn it, and they say you get 2.86 tons of carbon dioxide. Like, what is that? You burn the coal, you get ash. There's nothing there. How is it, and where is 2.86 tons of carbon dioxide up in the atmosphere? How does that work? I just could not understand it until I went a little further and looked at what is the atomic weight of carbon is 12, oxygen is 16, two oxygen atoms, carbon dioxide, the molecule, CO2, carbon, and 2 oxygen atoms has an atomic weight of 44. Who knew? Who knew? I'm sure some of you knew, but I didn't know. So what does this actually mean? In class, they gave us a calculation of when you burn carbon, how much emissions. And they showed the formula. They gave an example. I frankly don't think too many people in the class did the calculation, but I knew enough to do the calculation. I set up an Excel spreadsheet and went to my gas and electric bill. And I found that my house, I used this is back in 2020, 1,026 therms of natural gas. Wow, natural gas, how wonderful. Now, at about a cost of about $650, really relatively cheap. It produced 5.6 metric tons of CO2 in the atmosphere for 100 years. So that's what we're talking about here. This is the problem. And we're all doing this. We're all burning it, and it's going into the atmosphere, and it stays there for 100 years. So what does this actually mean? What does it look like? Well, you have, let's go back to 1880, before mankind was burning fossil fuel. A photon would come from the sun, it would hit the earth, and much of it would be absorbed, much of it would bounce back. If it would hit the ice, it would bounce back. Certain times the earth would radiate photons back into space harmlessly. In 1880. But we get to 1900, we've now been burning fossil fuel for 50 years. So we have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I just showed you about burning coal. But 1900, most of the heat is still going up into the atmosphere. But by the year 2000, now we've been burning coal for 150 years, and human beings are pretty good at it. We've been really burning it, and some of that will hit the molecule. And when it hits the molecule, the photon hits the molecule will vibrate. Heat is the movement of molecules, and that photon will be thrown off by the molecule, may go off into space, or may go back down to Earth and that's what we call global warming. We go from the year 2000, 20 years later, to 2020, and now we have methane thanks to our friends who are doing fracking, introducing natural gas, putting it to us as a transition fuel, and now it'll hit the CH4, much of it, and we have much more coming back. So what it looks like is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We have the graph of that going in this direction, and we have global temperature going in this direction. Now, by the way, just take a look at this. I always thought this was interesting. Look what happens in 1940. You see this bump? That, I think, is World War II. World War II is a bump in global temperature. We'll see what happens with this war in Ukraine. But you can also see what's happened in the last 20 years, how much global temperature has risen. So this is what we're up against. So mitigation is how to turn that around. So in 1992, the world got together and they met in Kyoto, and the Japanese prepared for that meeting. This is the IPCC that I told you about earlier. And they set worldwide standards. So if you get into this field, you're going to have to know GWP, global warming potential, GWP. The GWP of carbon dioxide was set by worldwide scientists at 1. For methane, when it's burned, it's 21. When it's leaked, it's 80 or even 100. It's much more damaging when it's leaked, and a lot of it is leaked. And then nitrous oxide, etc. So if you go for this certificate, I can assure you, you're going to have to know, in the exams, you're going to have to know the terms of the 7 greenhouse gases. So now let's look at how these 7 greenhouse gases are used in our work moving ahead. This chart was New Zealand. They put this out 20 years ago. I went back to them. I got permission to reprint it. Here you see the greenhouse gases in the cloud, in the atmosphere. Now, where do they come from? So these scopes, and you'll see this in all the literature worldwide, they'll talk about scope 1 are the ones that our companies produce ourselves. So these are materials that we own. Scope 2 are indirect that we get from purchased electricity, and scope 3 are indirect from our supply chain or from our customers. And then we would do a chart like this, a baseline, scope 1, 2, and 3, the total CO2 equivalent, and then what they are. So someone in your company is going to be producing these charts. I'm suggesting that we as quality professionals can do this. And that allows us to make these claims. So here's the target retail stores making a claim of producing 100% electricity from renewable sources, and they would have a chart like the one I showed you to prove reports to the SEC. And this is how they would do it, by installing solar installations in their stores. So let's look at the reporting team. So that's mitigation, how to lower it. You have to know what it is in order to lower it. So then you have reporting, and for reporting you have the ISO 14064, which is the specifications and guidance for the reporting of greenhouse gases. Now, if we're reporting, then there's an audit trail, there's a report, a calculation, a record date. So we in the quality professionals, we've been doing this for years and years. We know how to deal with auditors. We've been auditors. We may very well want to take on that role, or management may ask us to take on this role moving ahead. So why is this important to the company? Well, in your K-10, in your reporting, this is now voluntary to the SEC, reporting the impact of climate change. But I can assure you this is now becoming, this may very well be mandatory, and certainly investors are asking this question. And if you go to your Wall Street and you look at the analysis of your IRA, you'll see this all over the place. They want to know the impact of climate change. And if you want to, the story I use is that at one point under the previous administration, a large piece of land was open for drilling, and it was stopped. Why was the drilling stopped? Were there people out there chaining themselves to the drilling rigs? No, it was the banks who stopped it. The banks said, we're not going to give you $1 billion. We're not going to invest $1 billion in this, in pumping more oil. So now we come to the fifth and final team, opportunity team, sort of how to profit from the fight against climate change. Well, the guru in this is Saul Griffith. In this book, I highly recommend Saul Griffith. And in the in the chat is his latest video, and this I actually just downloaded today. It was so powerful. He does these charts and explains, actually there's some hope, but this book I highly recommend, and he talks about 1 billion new machines. And I've been working with someone at his organization called Rewiring America, and we'll be offering this as a workshop, 1 billion new machines, for any of you who are interested in doing something for your ASQ sections. There'll be a talk offered on 1 billion new machines, which is the solution and a great opportunity. And here's an example of an opportunity. Target stores putting in charging stations while people shop. That's sort of an easy one. Here are some other ones. Timberland shoes using recycled tires, Johnson Controls, a recyclable battery that can be recycled, and there are many examples of companies making profits based on the interest in recycling. Of course, this is the biggest opportunity, is solar panels, wind farms, and electric vehicles. Also for the house, we have solar panels and batteries. And look at this. These are actual apartment buildings that are all electric. No gas in these buildings. They use electricity for heat. They use heat pumps. For water, they use electric heat pumps. In fact, here are some heat pumps like this, individual heat pumps, which are highly efficient. They've really been perfected. And large heat pumps for large facilities are also been perfected. Here's a wonderful book from Rewiring America on how to electrify your homes. And I'm working with Joel on this development of the 1 billion new machines project. And this is available free from the site. Just Google Rewiring America and you can download this book. And then, of course, another opportunities for us individually is to take this course at ACO and actually learn more in depth about climate change. So this is a talk: strategy, adaptation, mitigation, reporting, opportunity, and now we'll take your questions.
That was great. I've seen your talk before. This seemed to be newer, different. I don't know. I learned a bunch of things that I hadn't seen before. So we do have a question from someone. What are your thoughts regarding the Bill Gates book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster?
That book, I know, I've read it. He talks about the green premium. He says we have to pay a little more for green. And he also goes through many, many industries. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. He goes industry by industry, talks about cement. There's a picture, as I recall, of him and his son visiting a plant somewhere. So he's been at this for a long time. I would highly recommend that book.
I'll just add that he's building an advanced nuclear power plant, I think in Wyoming. I'm not sure it's the latest design like it should be, but one of the solutions that I believe strongly in is fourth generation advanced nuclear power, which is safe. It cannot melt down. It will use as fuel the barely used fuel stored in pools around the commercialized light water reactors that are now in service. So it's a twofer. We'll get rid of all that because it's fuel for the advanced design reactors. And of course, what we're looking forward to is small modular reactors, not s'mores, Girl Scout cookies, but SMRs, or small modular reactors. And if we don't do it, I can be quite sure to tell you that the Chinese will be making them at shipyards and shipping them out to the waiting world. Another industry will have lost. And how many do you want? They're the size of very big refrigerators. Plug in 2, 4, 6, 20. Just plug them in and up they go. So nuclear power is needed for when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. And when the sun shines and the wind does blow, they can continue running to make hydrogen, which is completely combustion free from production to consumption on the road, where the only pollution is a trickle of water at the exhaust pipe.
For those of you who have a question about the chat, you need to scroll to the top of the chat. I put these in before the session actually started. So scroll to the top of the chat and you can see all the links to websites, to books. and to some videos. And to my contact information, if you would like a workshop like this, or the workshop on 1 billion new machines for your section or your division, or for your company for that matter. I see one question was, why did the banks stop their financing of oil drilling? They stopped their financing because they said, you know what, if we're going to spend $1 billion, let's invest it in wind farms rather than in fossil fuels. They're just understanding that fossil fuels is a dying industry. The world is not going, the world is not going to tolerate it anymore. They see the writing on the wall and they're just reluctant to do it. And they're also getting pressure from their boards and their stockholders. People who have grandchildren. If you're sitting on the board and you've got grandchildren, you're saying, what am I doing? I'm going to let my company invest in more drilling.
Sure. Are you looking at the chat, David? There's a lot of questions there.
I'll read the questions.
Okay.
In calculating Scope 1 and 2 emissions, is there a single source for calculation facts? Do you need a source to find sources for each nation my company operates? You know what? It gets complicated. It gets complicated. There are classes, there are courses on how to do it. It gets really complicated. And go to the ISO, or the other source is there's a European group, greenhouse gas protocol, that has an entire 60-page standard on how to do it, including classes on how to do these calculations. But yes, they're doing them, calculating in different countries by the different sources of energy. What are your thoughts on integrating the team and work with your major suppliers, customers, and others in the value chain? Absolutely. Great opportunity to work with your suppliers and your customers to help them lower. Oh, another big part of this question is, and you can start doing this even now, what is the carbon content, or what are the emissions produced by the raw materials that you use? I was in a class the other day, and the presenter said that Apple has done this very extensively, and they found that the biggest source of emissions came from the aluminum casing on their Macs. So if you have a Mac like I have in my hand, the aluminum casing, to produce that aluminum casing, created a lot of CO2 emissions. So they went to their suppliers and they found a very easy solution to lower the amount of CO2 emissions from the aluminum case. So you can do that because they're actually starting to look at what are the emissions in each component of your products. And there's a whole industry in terms of doing that, looking at your products and what are the CO2 emissions made in your entire supply chain. Historic data on the sea level rise in the other centuries. We've lost some islands. There was a chart I showed you that showed sea level rise. They had records, historic records, and then there are records now, scientific records, and now by satellite records to show the sea level rise. And yes, we've lost some islands. There's an island off the coast of Maryland that's now completely gone. I don't know, Richard, do you want to comment on that?
Sharps Island.
What's the name of it?
Sharps.
Yeah, so there's an island that's completely gone. We can't see those. Okay, I will add the, I will re-add the links. How does impact of climate change influence how quality professionals appreciate the system? You know, Dr. Deming talked about the total system. We have to look at the whole system. And climate change is part of the system now. We have to consider it. And I also think of, if those of you are familiar with Taguchi loss function, where there's the you know, we're used to seeing the normal curve, especially the Japanese got these very narrow curves. I remember early on in the 80s, Ford did the Dearborn study where they saw the narrow curves around the nominal of the parts in the transmission study, the famous transmission study. And then Taguchi did this kind of U-curve, which would show the loss to society. And, you know, there's tremendous loss to society that we're looking at. Unknown, unknowable, unmeasurable potential losses So as quality professionals, I think we have to step up to the plate.
Everybody should be able to see them now. And David, I guess you're looking at questions.
Okay, does the NOAA website have resources on clean water access limitations due to various climate models? Also, are the resources available on energy grid risks by the nation? There's a ton there. Just Google it. There's a ton of information. When I started taking these classes, I had to Google literally everything. I have a list. I have a 20-page list of Google sites that I've went to, background information. It's very easy. Just Google these questions and it's there. A lot of it's very accessible. The effect of the new anti-climate. Okay, so here's the question: anti-fossil fuel energy plan have on banking. Well, let's just go to the question of the Inflation Act. Let me just share with you. I did do a couple of slides on this. So this is very quickly, as the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. This will be on the president's desk over the weekend. So part of what you have to know about this is 41% of inflation is due to the cost of fossil fuel. So 41% of inflation is due to fossil fuel. 42% of greenhouse gases come from our cars, the heating and cooling of our homes, the heating of our water, drying our clothes, and cooking our foods. So remember I showed you that a slide about the house? So these are what we do in our house. So we will save 3 billion gallons per year just for our household heating and transportation. This is not industry. These are individual people, what we as individuals. So what this law does is where, and Richard and I were talking about it today, previous bills, and would have been very effective if they could have only been passed, put a tax on carbon. So Biden had been through that with Obama, and they didn't pass it and couldn't pass it. So what this does is it does something quite different. It takes this 42% and it creates incentives so that we as consumers will be buying these products. We'll be buying electric cars, we'll be buying heat pumps, we'll be buying induction stoves, and there'll be incentives to buy these products. And the consumers will pull industry into all electric. What it will look like if we're successful is these are the new goals. This will get us, with this new bill, will get us closer to the 50% goal. A household will save about $1,800 a year because we won't have to buy fossil fuels. We're buying electricity. This will be a heat pump. So the theory is the next time your furnace goes, instead of buying another furnace, you'll buy a heat pump. The next time your hot water heater that uses gas, when that rusts out, you'll buy a heat pump hot water heater. The next time you need a car, you'll buy an electric vehicle. The next time you need roof tiles on your house, you put on a solar panel. That will then, by not buying fossil fuel, you'll create on average $1,800 a year. Theoretically, if someone took that $1,800 and put it in the bank, which we know most people won't do, and there's really no expectation people will actually do it, but it would be like an IRA. It'd be $30,000 in 10 years, $140,000 in 20. So it's savings like an IRA, although no one really takes that, I don't think, too seriously. But there would be substantial savings in households. And this is what it might look like. There'll be incentives, a new heat pump, hot water heater, space heater for the whole house, electric stove, and these are what the prices would look like. So if you were a family, there's a whole section in there for families that are, I don't know how to say this gently, poor families, for example, 50,000 or below. There would be incentives for them to electrify their homes. There's also a provision for renters. So they really tried to create this so that consumers will pull these we'll pull these prices. By the way, this is what the whole process looks like. This is the money that will come from the 15% corporate tax, and this is where we'll be going. These are tax credits, other incentives for individuals. A lot of this will be administered by the states, other climate incentives. This will be a methane fee for those companies that can't cap their wells. They'll have to pay for the methane pollution, make that very expensive, so they'll start capping the wells. But most of it is incentives rather than tax-based.
But how do we assess the life cycle emissions or footprint of products or services? I mean, any thoughts on that? Like, who owns the stuff, or who's responsible?
There are websites. Just put in carbon footprint, Google carbon footprint, and there are calculators to calculate the carbon footprint, both for individual households and for businesses. So there's a way of calculating the carbon footprint of a business or a product line. You actually can look at the individual makeup of your products and start doing spreadsheets on what are the emissions that are going to be created by your supply chain and by the components of the products you manufacture.
Great. Well, thank you, David. I see we're up at the top of the hour. Folks, I want to say thank you for spending the time. Other than that, gentlemen, I'd like to say thank you very much. I really do appreciate your time. Folks, I think that you've seen David and Richard's contact information, right? So if somebody wanted to, I'm sure you guys are visible on LinkedIn, for instance, so they could search for you. Or what if somebody wants to get a PDF of the presentation? Would that be okay?
Send me a note. I'll be happy to do it, or I'll send it also to you, Manny.
Okay, what I'm going to do real quick then before I disconnect is I will just chat out your email address. Okay, and then that'll just be an easy thing to take care of. So
we'll be happy to provide that.
Okay.
And if you want a presentation for your chapter, or even for your company, Richard and I, we're volunteers. We just, we're retired guys. We need something to keep busy, so we'll be happy to give these talks. And if your company, if you have 5 people and you have a management person, a power person, we'll be happy to give them a talk on this. Just write to me and
I did chat out your email address and I put mine out there too, just in case there's any questions.
Yeah, and I'm Richard's business agent, so you can just contact me and I'll contact Richard.
That's right. When Richard says he has people, he really means David. So, all right. Hey, gentlemen, thank you. Really do appreciate your time, folks. Enjoy the rest of your day. We'll see you next time.
Thank you very much. And Manny, thank you, and thank everybody. And I appreciate your division for having done this.
Oh, we'll be in touch, David. No worries.
Okay,
all right.
great.
Bye now.
Take care, everyone.